Hey, welcome back. I'm Bob Cargill, and I'm here with a very special guest. This is Dr. Mark Goodacre, professor of religious studies at Duke University, and he's written a new book. And this book is an interesting take, very provocative title, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. So I'm interested to talk to Professor Goodacre. Mark, welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Absolutely great to be with you, Bob.
I went to school, and I was taught that there were three synoptic gospels.
Yeah.
What are you talking about, a fourth synoptic gospel?
Well, for a start, it's quite provocative. I like the idea of being provocative. People are more likely to pick it up if you're provocative, but I do believe it. I do believe it. Because here's the thing. Every day that I was writing this book, I picked up a gospel synopsis, which is a book that puts the gospels in parallel columns. And do you know what? How many columns are in there? 4.
3. Oh, yeah,
4.
well, there's 4, but it's always Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right?
But here's the thing.
Right.
Okay, I'm mucking about a little bit.
Okay.
Most of the time it's 3.
Yeah. But they always do put the John over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've got all these, and so I started thinking, well, hold on a minute. Therefore, John sometimes is synoptic. By definition, if he's a 4th column in the book, he's sometimes synoptic.
Sure.
So then you ask the question, are there any places where he's closer to one of the others than they are to each other? And there are loads of them. I'll give you an example, the anointing story.
Right.
John is closer to Matthew and Mark than Luke is. So you've got Matthew, Mark, John, really, really similar in the anointing story, and you've got Luke over here. So there, John is more synoptic than Luke.
Okay.
So why not just say, hey, look at him being synoptic?
Well, yeah, but that's not what I was taught, right?
No, exactly.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels.
Yeah.
And they tell all these stories that John doesn't tell. And John tells all these significant stories that the synoptics don't tell. Right. So there are 3 synoptics, and John's not a synoptic.
Well, I tell you what I think's happened here.
Okay.
I've taught that myself for 20, 30 years.
Right.
I do, and I spend like ages in class. This is how different John is. He's so different. Even in the feeding of the 5,000, even the word for bread and fish is different. You know, I mean, like he's just so different because I want them to get that in their heads.
Right.
The problem is, a lot of us, we do this, we do it in our New Testament introductions, but then we start believing our own rhetoric.
Yeah, sure.
You know, we basically start believing it so much that we actually start reading it through the lens of that pedagogy.
Right.
And I started saying, well, John isn't that different. I mean, yeah, he's different. I mean, let's face it, Luke is also very, very different from Mark and Matthew.
This is true.
And so maybe John's just like on a kind of spectrum where you've got Matthew and Mark. I think Matthew's really close to Mark. Very similar.
Yeah, sure.
But then you've got Luke here, and then John's like over here somewhere. So, and difference is always a question of degree. It's not absolute. There's, you know, it's not like kind of, well, you've got these Gospels that are synoptic and John isn't. It's a question of degree.
Degrees, yeah.
So
on a spectrum.
So that's really, exactly. Yeah. It's always a spectrum. That's what I'm kind of getting at with this.
Yeah, it's almost like you're listening to your own rhetoric, kind of like you would be, with, let's say, with Q.
Yeah.
Because I was taught a certain thing with Q, and then I read your book on Q, and I was like, oh wait, maybe we ought to think something different. So you're saying the same thing might be true about John.
Exactly, yeah.
I remember the story about Malchus, the high priest's servant, and the cutting off of the ear.
Yeah.
This is another example of this, correct?
It's a beautiful example of where John is synoptic. So this is the arrest story. If you go to the mainstream synopsis that all gospel scholars use by Allant, 4 columns, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and you can lay them side by side. And do you know what? There's Matthew, Mark agreements. There's Matthew, Luke agreements. There are Mark, John agreements. There are John, Luke agreements. Let me give you one example. Which ear was it? So Luke and John, right ear. Matthew and Mark's just the ear.
Right.
All right, it's a little thing, but you've got an agreement between Luke and John. Matthew has Jesus saying, put away your sword. He struck the thing, put your sword away, put it back in its sheath. John has that too. So you start looking at it thinking, hold on a minute, John's got agreements with just Matthew and just Mark and just Luke and with 2 of them and then 3 of them. So I thought, well, so in fact, I had this chapter, it was called When John is Synoptic. And it was all about cases like this.
Right.
And basically, my publisher said, can we go a bit more provocative here and just go 4th synoptic gospel? And I went, okay, sure. Because it's true, it's true. And it's one of those things where, look, I'm not actually proposing that we change the the word.
Right.
I'm not proposing that we start saying from now on there are 4 synoptic gospels.
Right.
Although if someone wants to talk me into it,
It'll
I might
sell.
do.
Yeah.
But no. So that's really the thing. And I mean, if people only read the title and they won't get the nuances, and you'll realize that I actually am saying in the book, there's tons of differences.
Sure.
But I think the differences are rooted in a really fundamental, basic literary conceit. That's the same.
Right. I like the Malchus example because we always, I've learned about the major things that John mentions that aren't mentioned in the traditional synoptics. Right. There's some big episodes that John talks about, but it's these little ones that you would expect. Well, there's no way that those would be the same, and for them to be identical, for those to be mentioned. How does one answer that? How does one justify that?
What I think is such fun about things like this, I mean, so let's be clear what's going on here. Jesus is arrested.
Right.
Someone anonymous in the Synoptics strikes the high priest slave's ear and cuts it off.
Right.
And in John, he says the high priest slave's name was Malchus and the guy that did it was Peter.
Right.
John does that all the time, So let's go back to the anointing.
Adds
the
these
names.
details.
Adds the
names.
Adds the names. So go back to the anointing story. Anonymous woman in Mark and Matthew and Luke, and then anonymous complainants there saying, who does this guy think he is?
Right.
In John, the woman is named Mary, and the people, it's no longer people complaining, it's one guy, Judas. This is what he does all the time.
Yeah, right.
There's even, doubting Thomas?
Right, yeah.
So doubting, Matthew and Luke have both got doubting disciples, both of them.
Right.
The disciples doubted.
Right.
I think what John's done is he's seen that because, okay, we'll give him a name. So it's a mark of what a great dramatist the fourth Gospels writer is.
Right.
Because he does this and he makes the story so much more compelling.
Fascinating. And you can't say, well, he's just coming in afterwards and copying them, because that's exactly what Matthew is doing, right? With Mark. So if Matthew and Mark are synoptics, why can't that be the same as John?
And I think, see, what a lot of scholars do is they'll basically say, John is different here. He must have been getting it from another source. He must have been getting it from the oral tradition or something like that. And I don't think you actually need that step a lot of the time. I think you can just begin by saying, well, let's just look at it alongside the synoptics and see if we can make sense of it with him looking at them, rather than bringing in lost cycles of tradition and lost sources. And I am, to be fair, a bit of a minimum sources person.
Sure.
It's not that I think these sources didn't exist.
Right.
And there must have been more sources than just what we've got. Tons of stuff was lost. The majority of literature was lost from antiquity. What I'm skeptical of is our ability to discover it from the text we've got.
Right.
That's the step. And I think I'm basically not actually that bold as a scholar because I don't think you can do archaeology on texts. I mean, and you get all these scholars who use archaeological analogies for textual work. Right. You can't actually dig down into a text and find a layer underneath. I don't think.
It's difficult to do. And the other question is, how frequently, you pointed to scrolls, Dead Sea Scrolls, but how frequently are you actually finding these large, elaborate texts, right? We know what we have, and you do some source criticism and you can do some redaction, but that's been done pretty much so.
Yeah, and I think it's always helpful when you've got closely parallel text. So it's easier to do the kind of source crit. So I love source criticism. It's my kind of lifeblood. I just find it endlessly fascinating. Once I'd finished doing the synoptics, I moved to the Gospel of Thomas, and then I've done that, so we moved to John, and I'm not sure what we'll do next. But basically, if you've got some parallel text, you can do that work because you can draw lines and you can get your coloring pencils out as well. But you can do that. So I'm not saying you can't do a kind of textual excavation.
Right.
But what I don't like is this idea of treating a text like an archaeological tell, and what you're discovering underneath is something that you've made up yourself. Right. That's my problem.
The self-fulfilling problem.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Fascinating. So John is kind of a synoptic gospel because of these parallels. And I know this has been a growing area of research, but you're coming along with a book and saying, let's actually lay this out.
Yeah. So well, and the thing is, if you start seeing John as a kind of fourth synoptic gospel, you can then ask the interesting question: how does John develop the stories in the synoptics? And one thing he does, which has not often been pointed out, he presupposes synoptic narratives that he doesn't narrate. So this is what argument
Explain
in the
this.
book.
Explain
so,
this. Yeah.
So the way that this is, so let's take the arrest scene again.
Okay.
At the arrest scene, this is the same one where Malchus gets his ear chopped off. At the arrest scene, you have this line where Jesus says, "Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?"
Mm-hmm.
The previous story in the Synoptic Gospels, all three, the previous story has Jesus praying to his Father, "Take this cup away from me."
Right.
Not narrated in John.
Right.
What John has done, it seems to me, is he's presupposed a story he hasn't narrated. And I think the reason he does that is he knows that his readers know that story. He doesn't need to narrate it. He's very selective, John is. I mean, remember, he's got 7 signs, not like 50.
Right.
He's got 7.
Right.
And he says at the end of the gospel, "I've chosen these ones because these will help you to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God." So he's choosing what to narrate, which means that I think he's made the actual decision that he's going to leave a whole ton of stuff out. If you're going to leave a lot of stuff out, there's then the question, well, can I just presuppose it? Can I do it as if the reader actually knows it? And I give 10 examples of this, and that's one of them.
Wow. Luke says something very similar, right? If was it Luke that says if all of the things that he did were collected, it would fill up a whole...
That's John 21.
That was John.
Yeah,
so that's actually John. So John's actually underscoring this very thing that he does.
And in fact, but Luke actually does a similar thing.
Right.
Rudolf Bultmann, the great New Testament scholar, Rudolf Bultmann, made a brilliant observation about Luke's gospel, which is that Luke doesn't want to imply that things happened next day, next day, next day, next day. Because if it does, then you've got 6 weeks of, it's not, not a year,
ministry.
2 years.
Yeah, right.
So he pointed out that what Luke does is he's consciously selective, and he'll say, "Oh, one day this happened."
Right.
And like he uses this phrase, like he always used to be translated, "and it came to pass."
Right, sure.
Which is a very sort of poncy way of saying, "Oh, this happened."
Right.
Oh, do you know what? This happened one day.
Once upon a time.
Yeah, once upon a time.
Yeah,
exactly. And John's doing something similar to that. He'll just say, "Okay, one day Jesus was doing this." In fact, sometimes the kind of narrative gaps in John are quite stark. I'll give you an example if I can.
Sure.
John chapter 5, Jesus heals a guy by the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. You have the whole story, whole controversy and everything. Then chapter 6, verse 1, and then Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. What? It's just like, he was just in Jerusalem. So he doesn't he doesn't construct the gospel like a kind of contemporary film or something where you have to have some kind of connections,
Right.
And that's another way in which he presupposes the synoptics, because that's the first time he mentions the Sea of Galilee.
Right.
Any side of it.
So they're jumping around.
Yeah. So if you say, the other side of the Sea of Galilee, it's presupposing that the main action has been taking place on this side of the Sea of Galilee. Well, where does that happen? It doesn't happen in John 1-5. It's not even mentioned it. It happens all the way through the first half of Mark's gospel.
It's almost like it's a serial or an episodic show where you can just, let's an old Gilligan's Island thing where you're just, I'm going to turn it on and I can watch a cool story about Jesus, but it's not necessarily, I don't want to say in sequence, but you can miss an episode and you're still going to watch a great story about the life of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, like some of the older scholarship on John's gospel, another thing I really dislike the kind of scholarship that says, I'm going to reconstruct the original order of John. So some people say, well, what sense does that make? Other side of the Sea of Galilee. So chapter 6 must have actually originally been before chapter 5. No manuscript evidence of that whatsoever.
Right.
And I don't like that because to me, whatever order you reconstruct it in, it's going to tell you more about the scholar doing it than the actual work that you're looking at.
Right.
So yeah, I like the Gilligan's Island. There's a sort of anthology kind of nature to John. But having said that, once he hits Jerusalem for the final time, then the sequence does become very important. So really from chapter 13 onwards, and then you really have got a narrative that basically flows where you have to have, the Last Supper. He doesn't narrate the Last Supper, but the evening of the Last Supper before he has the arrest and the trial and the crucifixion. So once you get kicked into that narrative, the second half of John is in a kind of a logical narrative sequence, which actually, incidentally, really closely mirrors the Mark and the Matthean sequence.
I do like this theory that he's presupposing things, because we do this all the time, right? Especially for an audience that knows the story.
Right.
And if John is written when we think that John is written, right? Not necessarily as early, but later, the idea would be, you've all heard this story that, you know this. Let me tell you another one. Let me tell you a part maybe that you haven't heard yet.
Yeah, exactly.
And he sticks it in there. So you're arguing that he's presupposing these things. He's like, I'm not going to waste your time with this story that you know.
Yeah.
Let me tell you something that you don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe you haven't heard yet. That's fascinating.
Well, absolutely. And like, I mean, you know, you've done lots of stuff, you know, on Israel and the geography of Israel and so on. John's the only gospel which actually has a story set in Samaria. I mean, and so chapter 4, you know, we suddenly get this amazing story about the Samaritan woman. And I think that comes out of the fact that, like in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, don't go anywhere amongst the Samaritans.
Right.
And then in Luke's gospel, where we have the Good Samaritan, which is a story,
right.
And then we have 10 men who have leprosy, and Luke's kind of weird about the geography there, but he mentions Samaria and he mentions they're Samaritans, and you're not quite sure where it is. And John's like, let's have Jesus in Samaria. Let's have him in Samaria, and then you get the gospel preached in Samaria before anyone ever knew, you know, that this was going to be the gospel, and people get converted and all the rest of it. So it is in a sense, it is a filling in gaps. Stuff that's left either confusing by the Synoptic Gospels, or they're not even mentioned by the Synoptic Gospels. John sometimes walks right into those gaps.
This is absolutely fascinating. The fourth Synoptic Gospel. This is from Erdman's.
Yep.
Everybody should go out and pick up this book. I can't wait to get my hands on a copy and to just read through it. And boy, I'm curious what my students are going to react if I start teaching this, and they're just going to say, wait a minute, that's not what I was taught growing up.
Yeah, I'm slightly worried about that angle of things myself, because when I stand up to do my intro New Testament lecture on John, and I'll be going, oh, it's so different. And one says, you know, the bright sparks sort of read my book. They're going, Professor, didn't you say? So obviously that's the peril, but we'll be fine. I mean, look, education doesn't have to be dull. It can be fun. It can be engaging.
Right.
And so one of the things I just want to encourage the debate. And sometimes to do that, you have to just be a little bit more provocative with your language. So that's what I'm doing there.
That's right. If you don't mind, let me ask you about that specifically. You've been doing public scholarship for quite a long time. In fact, I've modeled a lot of what I've done based on your career, especially early on with the blogging and the podcasting. Tell our audience, why is that important? Why do you find so much passion in doing public scholarship in addition to your research?
Well, one selfish answer to it is that the more you attempt to be a good communicator with a broader public, the better a scholar you become. One of the problems in scholarship is you can't just do your research and then hope that somehow people will pick up, you know, your ideas, you know, through telepathy. So you have to find ways of articulating it. Now, learning to articulate your ideas well is one of the most important skills in life, but I mean, especially in the humanities. And I found that the more I talk to different audiences in different formats, the better a scholar it makes me, if that makes sense. Sure. And I actually miss my blog. I used to blog all the time, and now I rarely blog. But one of the things I loved about it is it enabled me to do things I couldn't do in a scholarly article or in a book.
Right.
I could be more informal. Right. I could even try some things out with a sandbox. I probably put some stuff on the blog that I would be laughable now, because I just got home from work one day, thought, let's try this out. Right. You know, tried a bunch of stuff out, you know. So that's part of it. But I suppose the more serious answer and the less selfish one is there are tons and tons of people out there, probably some watching this, there's tons of people out there who really, really are interested in this stuff. And I think some of our colleagues in the universities sometimes underestimate just what thirst there is for knowledge, in this case about the ancient world. I mean, you could pick other things, but, you know, we're both, you know, interested in the ancient world. So many people are interested in digging down into the ancient world, but they can't pick a book off the shelf that's got tons of Greek in it, or Coptic or Hebrew or really technical language, because that requires a lot of the time you to do, you know, graduate degree and all the rest of it. So finding a way to speak to those people who genuinely have a thirst for knowledge, I think it's, to me, it's something we should all be doing. It should be part of our mission as intellectuals, I think.
I believe, especially for those of us who teach at public universities. I just remember before I went to grad school, being someone who I said, you know, I'm smart. I'm not dumb, right? I'm a smart person. I'm genuinely interested in this, but I can't. Like you said, I can't. I didn't yet know Greek. I didn't yet know Hebrew. but I'm smart. I want to know these things.
Mm-hmm.
I wish there was a way that I could learn credible information from good scholars.
Absolutely.
I wish they would speak to me and not just to other scholars. And I always said I wanted to be someone who's not just doing, credible research, but I wanted to speak to the public as well. I never wanted to forget about, that younger me out there who was like, I want to have good information as well.
Do you know that it's funny? We have a quite similar origin story here. I often think back to when I was like 16, 17 years old. I was a geek, right? I mean, I actually desperately wanted to read all the biblical scholarship I could. That was my area I was most interested in. It always annoyed me when I picked up the book and it had Greek in it that I couldn't read and it didn't translate it.
Right.
Because what they're doing there is they're closing the door to me.
Right.
As an enthusiast. And at 16, 17 years old, I didn't have a means of learning. I didn't even know how to get an elementary Greek textbook. Eventually I found out and I got one. And I took it on holiday when I was 18.
Really?
And I spent the whole summer learning Greek.
Learning Greek yourself.
But the point of that is I always remember that about myself, because if more of those books had tried to invite me in.
Right.
I still like in my books, so in the new book, I have the Greek, but I always translate it.
I do the same thing.
I think it's so important because, and also in the universities, the vast majority of my undergraduates don't have Greek.
Right.
I have one or two that do, because I teach in a religious studies department. A lot of my students are not majors in religious studies, so they haven't got Greek, let alone Hebrew or Coptic or Latin. So, so the thing is, if I don't translate it, I'm actually closing that book off to my own students. Never mind people in the wider world. So I have quite a similar origin story in the sense that I just think back to teenager me.
Right. I remember that, and I do the same thing. Anytime I put a Hebrew line in there or an Aramaic line, I always put the English right beneath it. I want people to be able to read my books who don't speak or can't translate Hebrew and Aramaic, Greek. But I also remember my grandmother, who would always take an interest in my scholarship, and she would always say, "Oh, Bobby, I saw that you wrote a book, but I don't know what's in it." And I always thought it was important to be able to let her know what it was I was doing. So it was important to be able to give a synopsis of the scholarship. And I remember growing up in church, there was always somebody in the back row, never went to college, there was a nice old lady in the back, and she would often ask the most provocative question. She never went to college, but she was smart. She knew her stuff. And I wanted to be able to communicate with her, not speak above her, not just, be too stuffy and sophisticated. That was the person that if I could connect with her, then I was doing my job.
Well, absolutely. And I think one of the great things about public scholarship, it's actually very encouraging a lot of the time. I mean, I've had emails from, guys who drive long haul, trucks. And sometimes they're doing, hours and hours in a day. And they say they don't just want to keep listening to music or, or whatever station they've got tuned into. And they'll download some podcasts on biblical studies, and they're driving along and they're listening to me yabbering on about Mark's gospel or something, And I think that's wonderful they do that. It's wonderful, So that's one of the joys, I think, of public scholarship. Plus, there's another side of it, which is, I bet you've experienced this as much as I have, and probably more, that some of the best questions and the best observations about your research come from people who have not been trained in the discipline. And sometimes that's because they haven't got a lot of the baggage that we've got, because some of that learning can be baggage sometimes because we've been taught to think in a certain way, and we're thinking down those lines, and then someone says, well, couldn't it just be like this? Why isn't it like this? And you're like, yeah, why isn't it? And I've had that a bunch of times. I mean, sometimes you get crackpot questions as well, but I mean, let's not worry about those,
No, but that's true. A lot of the kindest emails I've ever received are from people who say, "Hey, I saw you on History Channel," or I saw one of your YouTube videos, and thank you for doing that. I showed that to my mom. I showed that to my dad. We're using that in our Sunday school, and that really made a difference in my life. They're not going to read some peer review article that I wrote, or they're not going to read, but they are going to watch these videos, and the world is moving in that direction.
Very much so.
Kids are watching streaming. Kids are watching YouTube.
Yeah, very much so.
For those of you who don't know, Mark has the NT podcast. It's been around for a long time, and you're moving that onto YouTube now. You're in the process of doing that. Mark's also in the process of creating some online courses now. Can you tell us a little bit about the online course?
Yeah, actually, at the moment, doing a course. It's called The Mysteries of the Synoptic Gospels. It's with the Biblical Studies Academy, which is run by Barton and Chris Huntley and a bunch of those guys. And it's not just me. They're going to roll this out in a bunch of other ways as well. And I've been really thrilled with the reaction to that course that I'm teaching. It's the first one that they're running, but they're planning on lots more. I've been thrilled with the reaction, and same thing applies. The comments that I get on things, a lot of it's very encouraging, and that's nice because our undergrads, they're too busy with their lives and trying to pass exams to say, Professor, that was wonderful. But so the proportion of praise is higher with these guys. Okay, that's another selfish thing, but also, again, making great observations, this kind of thing. And also, for me, it's actually taught me a new thing about teaching. And it's one that the concentration that it takes to do some of that material well is actually, it makes me realize just how much I'm reliant on human beings in the classroom normally, the physical presence. So that's been good. That's a good challenge. Because like I'm saying, with different styles of writing, I think different styles of presentation can also hone you as a scholar and as a human being.
I do rely a lot on that feedback that I get from the students, so that it's I'm assuming it's like a comedian when they're up on stage and they know when they're getting that, or a rock musician when they're getting that feedback. They also know when they're bombing, when they're up on stage and they're like, this isn't going so well. So I know that when I'm up there and lecturing and they're falling asleep, or when I've got them, when you own the room, right? When you're in there, and so that's a good feeling. But it also knows this is good material. I need to, this is how I need to present this going forward, or I need to figure out a different way to present this stuff. This isn't going to work. I need to figure out, if I write this into a book, I need to come up with a different way to present this material.
And there's a cultural side to this as well, which is, so, I'm in America, I've been here for nearly 20 years, but I've still got this accent, I'm stuck with it. So there's a certain cultural barrier potentially when people hear me speaking. They might think, oh gosh, okay, is he quite one of us? And learning how to, it's obviously harder for someone who's speaking a second language, at least I'm speaking English, but to work out how certain things to drop in what I say. I also had to learn when I first came to America, I had to learn how to slow down my speaking. And it's basically because if you're listening to a foreign accent, you will often miss the ends of words and the ends of sentences. So I actually had to change completely how I spoke to undergraduates, because I kept finding they were missing things.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Because one of them said, in those early days, they said, he's okay once you've tuned in. You tune into him after a while. And I thought, I don't want them to have to tune in. I don't want them to have to do lots of extra work. So I trained myself to do more of that. But it then makes you aware, and it's also, of course, as you go on through your career, the gap in ages between you and your students gets ever wider.
Right, sure.
And that also is quite important, because you realize that there are certain cultural assumptions that we had as graduate students a couple of decades ago that the students don't have now.
Right.
So there's that side of things as well. And then if you're speaking, going back to the online courses element, or for that matter, YouTube or the podcasting, then you're speaking to people everywhere. All over, you look at the pattern where everyone's, and you just see this map with people everywhere. Right. And then, insofar as you can guess, tons of different ages and obviously different educational levels. So that there is a bit of a challenge as well, because it's not like being in the undergraduate classroom where they're all mainly the same age. And like in my case, they're mainly American, though not all, so on. But with doing the public scholarship, you actually have to constantly take a step back and say, does this make sense to someone who's listening in Nigeria? Who's never left Nigeria and has no experience of this very American or very British analogy that I'm using.
And I find myself always trying to update my pop cultural references.
Yes.
And the things that I worked 20 years ago don't work. And they don't work around the world.
No.
So.
Well, I actually had that recently. I always used to use an analogy from the TV show Columbo when I was talking about editorial fatigue in the Synoptics, and none of my students have watched Columbo, but then a lot of them have watched Bridgerton, and I spotted a continuity error in Bridgerton when I was watching it, and I thought, great, I'm going to grab that. So I did a few screenshots, and I actually use that sometimes now when I'm doing that stuff.
Works.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah, that makes you hip again.
And the thing is, I don't expect them all to have watched Bridgerton, but nearly all of them have heard of it.
Right.
And so there's no cultural barrier there.
Right.
They're not going, what's he talking about? It's oh, Bridgerton, how funny the professor's watching that.
I always like updating them and being hip one more time.
Yes, yeah. It gets harder though, doesn't it?
Anyways, Mark Goodacre, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us. Again, the book is The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. Run out and pick it up today. Again, thank you for
Always a
taking
pleasure,
the time.
Always a pleasure.
Yep. And thank you for joining us today.